Welcome to this episode of the Rebel Justice Podcast. I'm Farah Damji. I'm one of the three women who started the View magazine, and I'm formerly an incarcerated woman. I was once the pet criminal for an over-enthusiastic Manchester University student, Jo Deacon, who used my experiences given to her without my consent in a book that she wrote as part of her academic research, and I knew nothing about it until a friend of mine who was studying criminology told me there was a whole chapter about me in this book that she had to study as part of her curriculum on female deviance. Imagine my surprise. Once bitten, twice shy, so understandably I've been put off by the thought of collaborating with academics since that unfortunate experience. I view them as outsiders of the system, trying to participate or articulate pain and dysfunction that they can never fully understand or comprehend because they will never experience it. Yet they demand to be a part of it, while those of us trapped inside this system are dying to get free of it. So Lisa Guenther is the antithesis of this prototype, an academic with a background steeped in phenomenology, the study of structures of consciousness as experienced from the first-person point of view, what we might call lived experience. Immediately, I warmed to her openness and her empathy. Much of her work is focused on solitary confinement or segregation. Angela Davis wrote, "The most well-known description of this vile practice is Charles Dickens's description of solitary confinement as torture and agony. After visiting Eastern State Prison in Illinois, he insisted that this daily tampering with the mysteries of the brain was immeasurably worse than any torture of the body." Today we're talking to Lisa Guenther, a renowned academic who's spent a large amount of her academic life researching segregation and the effects of solitary confinement, which are tantamount to torture, on prisoners and people held in custody. I'm really interested to find out from you, Lisa, what inspired or sparked your interest in criminal justice and sort of sociology and the arts in general.
Yeah, sure. Well, it was a long and winding path. So I did my PhD in philosophy, and I wasn't studying prisons or punishment or really very concretely social issues. I was doing a project in feminist philosophy, but it was pretty abstract. It was not very grounded in social practice. And my philosophical framework was phenomenology, which is a philosophical orientation towards lived experience. And so my research when I was a PhD student was motivated or moved by a friend of mine who had a baby, and I was present at the birth, and I was just blown away by the immensity of everything that was happening, and the absence of a language to talk about this event of birth. And I thought, what is it about philosophy that nobody talks about birth? Everybody's talking about death, the meaning of death, and birth is at least as philosophically rich and mind-blowing as anything else. And of course, the obvious answer to that is that, well, philosophy has been the domain of men, mostly white men, for so long, and birth was just not on their radar. And so my way into thinking about prisons and solitary confinement in particular was eventually moving to the United States for a job teaching philosophy. And I lived in Nashville, Tennessee. And as a white woman in the US South, I experienced my race and my gender in a different way. And it felt like my body and my social positionality was being weaponized as that which needs to be protected. And so that which justifies this whole apparatus of racialized violence in the form of policing and incarceration. And without being asked or giving my permission, I felt like I was one of the alibis for that system of violence. But that was not an analysis that I immediately had access to. It was by learning from the former political prisoner and philosopher Angela Davis, who came to the campus where I was teaching. And she was actually giving a very intense graduate seminar, just a 6-week graduate seminar in our department. And I was a new professor, and I asked if I could sit in on the class. And the class was on slavery. And it began with the 13th Amendment, which purportedly abolishes slavery in the United States, except for those who have been duly convicted of a crime. And that was when I first learned that actually slavery was not completely abolished with the 13th Amendment. It continued and it was reinscribed in the prison system. And so Angela Davis's seminar was on prison slavery. And we read texts about slavery in the context of the 150 years or so since the abolition of slavery. And it was in that context that we read a few testimonies of solitary confinement. And as soon as I read the descriptions that people were giving of their experience or their unraveling of experience in prolonged isolation, it struck me that they were describing something that was completely at odds with the way that the architects of that system or the inventors of that practice imagined and basically sold the idea. They sold the idea as something that was basically going to take someone out of a corrupt world and reset them, basically turn them off and then repower the machine so that then they would be good, upstanding citizens and they would behave properly. And the experience that people were actually describing in undergoing this extreme isolation was feeling like a ghost in their own life, feeling like they had been buried alive, feeling like they were cut off from the world, but in a way that didn't just make them sad or lonely, but started to unravel and tear apart their own ability to think clearly, to keep track of time, to even feel like this is where I end and this is where the world begins. And so that struck me as a kind of torture, as you said, a kind of violence against the very structure of being, of human being. And so my research, my more kind of concrete sociological research into solitary confinement began there with this seminar with Angela Davis and with these testimonies of people who were sharing an experience that was at the very limits of experience.
Wow, there is so much to unpack there, and we love Angela Davis. So I'm not surprised at all that she was the seed for this incredible body of research and work that you've done. There's so much to unpack there. These parallels between slavery, oppression, and incarceration. We're so frightened to voice them, but actually that's exactly what they are. And if you look at the prison system here in Canada and America, any kind of westernized carceral estate, I think the reason they get away with it is because there's far too few people voicing the violence that's being done. Why do you think it's important to talk and think about segregation and the way that women experience it? I just want to tell you, I'm one of the women who started The View. There were 3 of us who started it in prison as basically like it was meant to be a kind of a glossy brochure for this crazy governor. And I have a background as a journalist, and I was kicking off all over the place because I was very happy at being recalled for complaining about immigration. So to shut me up, she said, look, why don't you start this prison magazine? You used to be a journalist, you write so well, all these complaint letters, which she wasn't happy about. So we did. And I'll send you some of the printed copies because I'm so proud of, what we've done. The first one especially is like a real punch in the gut. So she got this incredible kind of rebellion of women's voices that, we weren't allowed to speak. We weren't allowed to say anything. We weren't allowed to swear. If you swear in prison, you get reprimanded, I mean, I have every other word that comes out of my mouth is swear words. So for me, this is completely unnatural. And you're not allowed to have any sense of self or who you are. You leave yourself at the prison gate. But I got put into solitary confinement for complaining, basically. And it was the hardest and most soul destroying experience. You just can't imagine. There's nothing. There's just the four walls, and there's no television. They're supposed to give you a radio, but they don't, even if they can get away with it. The psychologist used to come and see me and say, look, the only thing I can do to help you is to keep you safe enough to get you out of here. That's all I can do. I can't treat you because you're being traumatized all the time. But I really feel from that experience and from the experience of other women who I know who've gone through this, that it has a deeply detrimental effect on your mental. I mean, mine wasn't very long. I managed to get hold of solicitors and I managed to get out, but a lot of women can't do that and they stay there. You know, we've got some of the most appalling statistics in this country of keeping people in segregation, and they call it the care and support unit, which is one of those big brother,
oh my God,
kind of, you know, the ministry of doublespeak has come out with this rubbish. So I was really interested to find out and to ask you about how you think it might affect women differently, and also the effects on women of solitary confinement.
Yeah, well, I mean, there's so much in what you just said that I would love to address and keep talking about, because I think what you said about being basically put in solitary to shut you up, I think is a pattern that I see like over and over and over again, both in prisons for women and prisons for men, that if you make too many complaints, and even or especially if you're making complaints about, in women's prisons, an experience of sexual assault by a guard. So I was an external examiner on a PhD thesis by someone named Maury Williams at Villanova University, and she really focused in on this, what she called the solitary cycle, that a woman would be assaulted by a guard, would make a complaint, and she would be punished by being put in solitary. So a double punishment, and precisely a silencing of the complaint, of the pushback through words that then deprives you of access to someone to share your words with. And so I think that that's just, it's a devastating kind of compounding of separation from the world in prison, then separation from other people in prison, in this prison within the prison. And I wonder, so when I was doing my initial research on solitary confinement, I was reading as many first person testimonies as I could on the experience. And I was finding lots and lots of testimonies by men and fewer testimonies by women. So in Asada Shakur's autobiography, she talks about being in solitary, but she doesn't describe it in this intricate detail. Most of what she's talking about, and many other memoirs of women in prison follow these lines, is being separated from their children and from their kin, both from elders and from young ones that they're responsible for. And so the isolation within solitary, where often you're not even allowed to have pictures of your loved ones, is compounding what this theorist of slavery, Claude Meillassoux, calls natal alienation, a kind of separation of you from the very people that you take care of. And so the fact that they would call these units care and support units is just mind-blowing to me. In Canada, we have claimed, because of 2 class action lawsuits, to have abolished solitary confinement, but we replaced them by structured intervention units. And so, but care and support units is like one level even beyond, precisely because it gets at this sense in which you're not just being punished for whatever, threatening the stability of the institution or whatever. You're being punished for being a speaking being, for expressing yourself, for being a relational social being. And the form of your punishment is you don't get to care for other people. You don't get to take care of yourself. And you don't get to take care of directly in an immediate way for other people. So that's one of the reasons why it just strikes me as so counter to that other rhetoric of rehabilitation or getting people back on their feet or support so that people can re-enter society. Because how would you ever actually find the support you need in isolation to be and continue to be someone who lives in a concrete relationship with other people. It's just totally counter to what even the system says it's doing.
Yes, but as you said before, it sells it on these very sort of highfalutin ideas of reintegration and rehabilitation, and reset, I think, is such a good word. But it doesn't exist. I think as a society, we're really conflicted about whether we want to punish people or whether we want to rehabilitate people, because the two drivers can't exist. They're totally oppositional and conflicting. And so you can't have a justice system that is retributional, that is punishing, that is vindictive, that is nasty, and at the same time pretend to have this rehabilitation programs. I mean, we know there's no such thing. It's all just nice words and, you know, dogma and people getting lots of money in private contracts. But I think what you said about the natal alienation is just, you know, the hardest thing is, as a woman, if you have children, or even if you don't, you know, nieces and nephews, or in your case, like the child that you saw being born, you know, there is such an incredible attachment to the people that we care about and the people that we love. And to have that wrenched away is actually such a denial of our own selfhood as well. It's really just wrenching out like the bit of you that is you, you know, that relational part that just makes sense of who you are in all these different relations, in all your different facets as a mother or a daughter or a child or an aunt or a lover or a friend. It just rips that away, and it is visceral, and it's deliberate, and it's intentional. And that, you know, those words, natal alienation, that's exactly, it's so stark, isn't it? It's so harsh. Do you think, and it's not sort of a race to the bottom for the genders, it's really not in my head, I don't think it's about that, but do you think that women are affected more deeply by the effects of segregation?
I've thought about this a lot, and I haven't actually, you know, like, I'm not trained as a sociologist. I sort of, I work with people in prison, but I don't like to write about the work we do. I'd rather work on projects together in a way that follows their lead on what they think is important to work on and amplifies their voices. So I've never kind of sat down and interviewed, you know, women who have been in solitary, men who have been in solitary, and done a comparative study based on different gendered experiences of solitary. But I started talking about this and then I distracted myself. When I was doing this reading for the book that I wrote on solitary confinement, and finding all of these like long descriptions of the experience of solitary confinement in men's testimonies, and acknowledgments that they were in solitary, but not long descriptions of solitary confinement in testimonies by women. Something that struck me was that a different gendered way of expressing oneself and putting the focus on, for Asada Shakur and Angela Davis, their testimonies, their memoirs are also, they're not just autobiographies like this is my experience as an individual. They are sort of collective autobiographies of a movement. And there's something about that collective orientation where I'm not going to spend pages and pages dwelling on my own experience. I'm going to talk about the strategies that were useful to me, that might be useful to other people for survival. I'm going to talk about what helped me to survive because I had connections to other people in a movement that I knew would go beyond me. And so I think that in listening to some of the silences and seeing what do women write about when they write a prison memoir, and what do they move over quite quickly in their writing, there is a focus on collective, relational, shared experience and helping one another that I think attests to what you were saying, and suggests that if you are a person who's deeply connected to other people and you can't be who you are without them, then the torture of solitary confinement is going to be even more visceral. And the fact that you don't write 10 pages about it is not in any way an indication that that was any less devastating an experience for you. It may be pointing to and suggesting that it was so devastating that you're not even going to put that on the page. That's something for you and for your close loved ones to talk about or not talk about.
I think what you said just neatly brings it back to what I wanted to ask you around your interest in phenomenology and philosophical study of objectivity. And you touched on that in the way that you just spoke about women's experiences. So that's the study of reality more generally as subjectively lived and experiences focused on academic research in a way that includes the voices and the experiences of the people who are going through these incarceration periods. How do you think that involving people with lived experience in your research is important? And how do you think it can affect your qualitative research as well?
Yeah, this is super important. So I think there are some things you just can't see unless you are looking at things from a certain angle or you have a certain experience. So even just if we stay within phenomenology as a philosophical discipline, which, you know, often philosophers in this field don't talk about complex social issues. They're talking about what is it like to perceive a table? Well, when I look at a table, I don't see all of it at once. I see it always from a particular angle, a particular perspective. And unless I walk around it and explore it from different angles, I'm not going to get a sense of the table as a whole. I'm just going to have quick shortcuts in my mind, like, I know what that is. That's a table. I don't really need to investigate it any further. And I think if we move from tables to complex social phenomena like punishment, segregation, incarceration, and criminalization, like who gets to count as a law abiding citizen and who gets labeled as a lawbreaker. Looking at those complex social phenomena, there are just certain things you can't see if you're looking at it from one angle. People who are directly affected by police surveillance that criminalizes them are going to see and notice the way that system works precisely because they have to navigate it on an everyday basis. So I think there are two things. There's one, you just can't see certain things unless you have a lived experience of them, but also you are less likely to see the connections between things unless you have a lived experience of something or are listening very carefully to and working in alliance with people who are directly affected, who have lived experience. So there's this 19th century philosopher and sociologist, W.E.B. Du Bois in the US, a Black sociologist, who coined this term double consciousness to talk about the way that he, as a Black man, both experienced the world from his own perspective, but he constantly had to be anticipating, noticing, analyzing, projecting the possibilities and likelihoods, probabilities of how white people were seeing him, how they would respond to him. And so he has a double consciousness. He sees the world from his own view, but he also had to see it from other perspectives just to be able to survive. And bell hooks, Black feminist philosopher, takes up this idea and develops it as a practice of seeing from the margins, that there's a capacity to know the world and to analyze what's going on that is enriched by being in a marginal position, not directly at the center, because you can't just use these lazy shortcuts like, I know what that is, that's a table. I know who that is, that's a criminal. I know who that is, that's a law-abiding taxpayer. And so that's one of the reasons why I think lived experience is so important. It's both seeing different things and seeing different connections between things.
That's really interesting. And I think that whole idea of double consciousness it's so tiring to even think about it, isn't it? Like it's such a huge psychological drain to like be living your life and then also looking kind of over your shoulder in 360 everywhere else about, well, what does everyone else think and what is everyone else seeing? And it's just such an incredible, it's like almost double the energy just to breathe and live and be. And I loved your analogy of the table and people and how actually people are not tables, which is quite basic, but
No.
we don't think that. Which brings me on to something again that you just slightly touched on, the idea of social death. Being incarcerated is not just about losing your liberty and losing your connections and the people you love. And, you know, it's supposed to only be about losing your liberty and the rest of your rights supposedly remain intact. But that is just so not true. That's another of these amazing fantasies or fallacies that's fed to people just to make the whole process of justice and incarceration palatable. From the very moment that you're arrested, indicted, enter this perverse criminal justice system, your social value is eroded. And by the end of the process, you know, so much of your identity has just been corroded by the experience through trauma and observing what's happening to people and witnessing what's around you. You can't not be affected by it. And also being told over and over and over again, you know, like if you're a child and you're told you're a bad child, eventually you're just going to believe it and be the bad child. And in the same way, I think what happens to women in this country is you are told over and over again, you will obey these rules. We will tell you when you can eat. We will tell you when you can sleep. We will tell you when you can shower. And at the moment, many of our women's prisons are still operating 23.5-hour lockdowns. And the excuse for this is, oh, COVID. Well, I'm sorry, COVID ended 2 years ago, but our system is in such a mess that they can't retain officers, basically. They can't. Young prison officers are getting so traumatized by what they're seeing that they're just leaving to go and join Border Force or Home Office or something else. They just don't want to be there. This whole thing of social death, I think, is really fascinating, and how it affects women and how you are entirely just negated as a human with a value by entering into this system that's supposed to be, as you said, resetting you to be a better person and a law-abiding person and all this other dribble that they put out there. So I'm really interested to know your thoughts around social death, and you've written about it extensively and so eloquently as well.
Yeah, this is something that I learned from that seminar with Angela Davis. So we read Orlando Patterson's book, Slavery and Social Death. And Angela Davis was making this connection between the social death of slavery and the social death of prison. And in both contexts, there are these rituals of stripping someone from the markers of social life from someone. So removing someone's name, giving them a number instead, taking away their clothes, all the choices that they've made to express themselves in a certain way to others through their clothing. No, you're not allowed to have that. Here's your uniform. Often, this is not necessarily something that everybody goes through, but sometimes, you know, like for the sake of the health of the institution, shaving people's hair off, like just completely stripping down all of the ways that we express ourselves to other people non-verbally, and the ways we're known to ourselves as having a very specific reality for other people, like our name. And so there are different rituals that unfold in different ways, but I think the logic of the system is to make you feel like you're socially dead. And then so many people, I think, have incredibly powerful ways of connecting with and maintaining and affirming their social life. Whether that is insisting that, you know, like I wear my uniform in a particular way, like I roll up the sleeves in a certain way, or I work with a group of women who were incarcerated at the Prison for Women in Kingston, and they just organized an amazing art exhibition. And one of the art pieces was a prison issued t-shirt that Kathy Porter, who was in prison in British Columbia, had incredibly modified so that it was this gorgeous woven, totally like deconstructed, reconstructed, no longer legible as a prison issued t-shirt, but as a work of art. This was one of the pieces in the show. And of course, that was punished as destruction of prison property. So this is, I think, where we see the logic of social death, which is imposed by the prison system, purportedly for the sake of rehabilitation or like resetting this person, putting them on the right track. And all of the creative ways that people push back against that and affirm, no, I'm very much socially alive. Like I'm an expressive person. I am a person. I have meaningful relationships with other people. And that was one of the critiques of this whole concept of social death is that Angela Davis shared with us in that seminar, but many other people have made in different ways, is that, and I'm kind of ambivalent about the degree to which I've leaned on this in my own research, that if you adopt this framework of social death and don't attend to all of the ways that people remain connected to loved ones and affirm their relationships, then you're basically adopting the perspective of the system. The system wants social death. But I guess it's a question for me as both a researcher and someone who wants to contribute to social movements to abolish prisons. To what degree does the language of social death box us into the framework of the system? So thinking about social life in resistance to social death kind of just, it might not seem like a huge difference, but I think it's that kind of pivot where instead of sitting at the table of like decision makers on who gets to be punished and who gets to be rewarded, versus maybe looking under the table and seeing all of the ways that people have kind of carved their initials and left their mark on the framework of social death that they've been set up to undergo. And I'm so fascinated by this magazine that you started in the prison, because at the Prison for Women in Kingston, which people call P4W, there was a prison newsletter called Tightwire, which I think is, so beautifully named because it is all about like that balancing act. That was a site of incredible creative expression, poetry, political analysis, drawing, art. And that's an example of like a super vibrant social life that had to operate within the framework of social death because the prison system itself had to sign off on each issue. They had control, kind of editorial control. But within the constraints of that system, the women managed to do incredible journalism and incredible, very subversive political work.
That's fantastic. And I love how you really emphasize the importance of words, because if we subscribe to these words of social death, then we're part of the problem. It's sort of like when people say women offenders or ex-offenders, it really just grates on me, because at what point do I stop being offensive, and to who, and who gets to judge? And it's just so oppressive to use that language. But yeah, I got into huge trouble with the prison magazine. So I got, again, put into segregation, and they ghost you around the prison estate, so no one can find you. So I was ghosted. I was in London, and my parole hearing was coming up for being recalled for being rude about probation, basically. And it was just being put off and put off and put off. And finally, I had a parole hearing date that they'd said they wouldn't change, but they ghosted me up to South Yorkshire from London, so 400 miles away. And there was no way the parole board was going to, lift its ass to go up to there. So lots of kicking off, lots of lawyers, lots of legal staff, and I managed to get the parole hearing. And the parole board said, no, this is an unlawful recall. You can't recall someone because you don't like what she's tweeting. That's a bit ridiculous. And I was released immediately. Well, not immediately. They put in all their delays and stuff, so it was 2 weeks later. But I sent out a copy of this prison magazine to a lawyer, which I wasn't supposed to do, but I did. And I'm glad I did, because then we managed to pick it up afterwards, and then Claire and Holly got involved, and they're the kind of the business side of it. But it's still very much the heart of everything we do, including this podcast, is the women that I serve time with, and their art in the magazine, you'll see it, is a testament to just the bravery and resilience and the ways that women have of like navigating the system that is not made for us, that is not our shape, that is not, even the clothes are made for men. Lisa. So you're wearing these like flat-chested t-shirts and these baggy trousers, and you just look completely ridiculous. I would love to see her subverted women's prison t-shirt. So something that's happened with us recently is we've been supporting a lot of the climate justice activists, Just Stop Oil, Extinction Rebellion, and Insulate Britain. So we've been supporting quite a lot of them. And at the moment, as I was saying, our prison system is operating under ridiculous restrictions. There's one in particular, Foston Hall in Derbyshire, where they haven't managed to arrange children's visits for literally more than a year. So these women are being given these sort of purloined, basically copyright stolen sheets of colouring pages that you would give to a child to colour in, right? And the Ministry of Justice is illegally downloading these colouring sheets of like Spider-Man and, the bunny. Everyone's seen the bunny picture that the child colours in. But these women are so resourceful. So they've taken the Spider-Man picture and they've got like all Just Stop Oil slogans all over it. The bunny has got like all flames behind him and oil rig. And it's just so we've made cards out of these, and then the women get back half of the proceeds of whatever we sell, the cards and the prints. So there is such a super resilience to all of the trauma and the violence, because it is an act of violence to incarcerate a woman. It is an act of state-endorsed violence that we are all signed up to, because we don't protest. We're all buying this lovely cuddly version of, oh, well, they need to be in prison and they're dangerous to society and all the rest of it. And actually we need to examine it, which is why I think words are so incredibly powerful. And you've really made me think about the whole way that we use social death and how we're buying into that, the perversion of it, really, aren't we? I learned so much in that conversation with Lisa Guenther, ending on the issue of words and social death. Feels like a precarious place to end this episode, part 1 of 2 with this insightful and compassionate academic. It's been a pleasure to speak with her on the View Magazine's Rebel Justice podcast. Join us next week to hear the rest of our conversation and how Lisa feels we can revolutionise international justice systems with radical shifts in our own behaviour by confronting our own comfortability with the carceral estate, which she feels is extended into our everyday, highly politicised and highly policed lives. The View magazine is the only platform by and for women in the justice system where we keep our experiences, strength and hopes at the heart of our organisation. In spite of enormous pushback from those who would prefer the status quo of opacity and disinformation. They say that sunlight is the best disinfectant. Pull back the blinds and join our resistance movement, fighting for a fairer justice system for all of us.